look at what they can't stop replaying. Yeah, that moment. The one they thought would pass quietly. The one they assumed would dissolve into nothing like all the other times you were expected to stay in your place. The one where the room was supposed to move on without resistance, without interruption, without friction. You were meant to remain the unspoken name, the convenient silence, the easy omission. But something happened, didn't it? Something shifted. Something snapped into place, so cleanly, so decisively, so completely out of alignment with their expectations that it sent a shock through the entire structure they thought they happened, controlled. And now they're asking questions they were never supposed to ask. Not about you directly, about the room, about loyalty, about authority, about who just crossed a line they didn't even realize was being guarded. Someone powerful, someone who rarely intervenes, someone who understands exactly how these dynamics work, watched the moment unfold and felt their internal model break because someone went to war for you in that room. Not loudly, not emotionally, not impulsively, calmly, deliberately, with precision. And the words that followed weren't admiration, they weren't praise, they were confusion sharpened by fear. Why would anyone do that? Why would someone risk position, standing, leverage for you? Because what just happened didn't fit the rules they rely on. It didn't fit the hierarchy they enforce. It didn't fit the agreement that certain people are safe to overlook, safe to diminish, safe to sacrifice without consequence. You see, they had you mapped out, didn't they? Your role, your ceiling, your relevance. They knew where you belonged in the room, which was nowhere that mattered. They thought your silence meant acceptance. They thought your restraint meant weakness. They thought your distance meant disengagement. They thought they understood the limits of how much weight your name could carry when spoken, aloud. And for a long time, maybe you let them think that. Maybe you stayed quiet. Maybe you didn't correct the narrative. Maybe you allowed them to believe you were alone, unsupported, unprotected, that you didn't have anyone willing to step into the fire on your behalf. And then it happened. That one moment, that interruption they didn't plan for, that defense they didn't see coming, because they were too busy watching the version of you they thought they had already neutralized. The shift was immediate. You could feel it. The air changed. The confidence in the room wavered. The unspoken hierarchy glitched, because when someone speaks up for a person who isn't even fighting for themselves, it exposes something dangerous. It reveals that the power balance they rely on is conditional, fragile, dependent on compliance. And the moment someone refuses to comply, the entire structure starts to wobble. Someone somewhere, someone with authority, someone who understands how influence actually moves, thought the same thing at the same time. This wasn't supposed to happen. Not for you. Not like NUs. Let's be very clear about something. That moment wasn't about fairness. It wasn't about kindness. It wasn't about morality. It was about alignment. Someone recognized something in you that didn't need defending loudly, only acknowledged correctly. And that recognition shattered the framework the room was operating under. Because when you build power on the assumption that certain people will always stay quiet, always absorb pressure, always accept eraser, and someone violates that assumption, it's not just uncomfortable, it's destabilizing. You became the variable they couldn't control without realizing it existed. Not because you spoke, but because someone else decided you were worth interrupting the script for. They thought your story was already written, clears that your chapter had ended somewhere earlier, quietly, without ceremony. They convinced themselves your absence from the conversation meant irrelevance. They told themselves that if you mattered, someone would have said something sooner. They used that silence to justify everything that followed. And then, in one precise moment, that justification collapsed. Because silence wasn't the truth. It was just unchallenged until it wasn't. Now, here's where the discomfort deepens. The person who spoke up didn't do it out of loyalty, the way they understand loyalty. It wasn't tribal. It wasn't emotional. It wasn't personal history. It was recognition of trajectory, of pattern, of something that doesn't announce itself early, but becomes obvious to those who know how to read rooms properly. That's what really unsettles them, because if that person saw it, others might have too. And if others saw it, then the assumption that you were safe to dismiss was wrong long before that moment. They're retracing conversations now, replaying side glances, reinterpreting pauses, trying to locate the exact point where the balance tipped without them noticing, because power hates being surprised, especially when the surprise comes not from rebellion, but from realignment. You didn't storm the room. You didn't force a confrontation. You let gravity do the work. You let the truth surface on its own timeline. And when it did, someone else took responsibility for acknowledging it. That's the part they can't neutralize. If you had defended yourself, they could frame it as ego. If you had argued, they could call it insecurity. If you had demanded respect, they could paint you as difficult, but you didn't. Someone else did the speaking. Someone whose voice carries weight they can't easily dismiss. Someone who doesn't gain anything obvious by standing up for you. And that absence of motive terrifies people who survive by tracking incentives. So now they're scrambling to reassert order quietly, subtly. They're adjusting language, softening edges, reframing the narrative to make it seem like nothing really changed, but it did. They know it did because the room remembers. Rooms always remember moments like that, moments when the script breaks and no one knows who's supposed to speak next, moments when the hierarchy hesitates, moments when the wrong person suddenly looks protected. You should understand something about these environments. They are not ruled by rules. They are ruled by permission. Who is allowed to speak? Who is allowed to challenge? Who is allowed to matter? And permission is rarely written down. It's enforced through silence, through repetition, through people learning exactly how far they can go before being corrected. When someone goes to war for you without asking, without signaling, without hesitation, it sends a message that permission has shifted, and shifts like that don't reverse easily. They're watching you differently now, even if they pretend not to be, even if they never mention it again, because now there's a question hovering over every interaction. Who else would step in? Who else is watching? What don't we know about this person that we assumed we did? And those questions create distance, caution, hesitation, the kind that weaken systems built on confidence and momentum. Here's the irony they're choking on. You didn't plan this moment in the way they understand planning. You didn't orchestrate it socially. You didn't lobby for support. You didn't manipulate alliances. You simply became someone worth defending without needing to ask. And that's a level of leverage that can't be fabricated. It can only be earned through consistency, restraint, and a refusal to perform desperation. They keep circling back to the same thought, even if they don't articulate it clearly. If this person was worth that kind of intervention, what else have we misread? What else have we underestimated? What other assumptions are we operating on that might collapse the same way? Because power doesn't fear opposition as much as it fears blind spots, and you just exposed one. What makes this even more unsettling is that you're not capitalizing on the moment publicly. You're not posturing. You're not changing your behavior to signal victory. You're not reminding anyone what happened. You're moving exactly the same way you were before. Calm, unbothered, focused. And that consistency tells them something they don't want to admit. This wasn't a fluke. This wasn't luck. This wasn't a one-off. This was alignment finally becoming visible. They're realizing now that your restraint wasn't submission. It was selectivity. That your silence wasn't absence. It was observation. That your patience wasn't weakness. It was timing. You didn't need to speak in that room because the moment required someone else's voice. And that tells them you're operating on a level where outcomes don't depend on constant assertion. They depend on positioning. Now, here's where the unease turns into something sharper. They can't confront you about it without exposing themselves. They can't ask why someone defended you without revealing that they believed you didn't deserve it. They can't challenge the shift without drawing attention to the instability it exposed. So they sit with it. They adjust around it. They carry it forward into future decisions in subtle ways. And every adjustment is an admission that the balance of power has changed. You should know this too. When someone goes to war for you in a room like that, it's never just about the past. It's about the future. It's about trajectories colliding. It's about recognizing who will matter later and choosing sides before it becomes obvious to everyone else. Someone made that choice quietly, publicly enough to be felt, and now the clock is ticking on a reality they can't stop from unfolding. Because moments like that don't fade, they echo. They influence how names are spoken, how opportunities are framed, how risks are calculated. You didn't walk out of that room elevated in title. You walked out recalibrated in perception. And perception is where real power lies. They wanted you small, contained, predictable. They wanted you grateful for scraps of acknowledgement. They wanted you dependent on their approval. And now they're forced to contend with the fact that you don't need any of that. That your position doesn't hinge on their consensus. That your relevance doesn't require their permission. Someone else already made that clear for them. And the most destabilizing part, this wasn't the climax. It was an early signal, a preview, a quiet confirmation that the structure they're relying on is already under strain. Because when one person is willing to step forward, others start reconsidering their silence. When one rule is broken without consequence, the rest start looking optional. And when one person is recognized as worth protecting, the story around them begins to change, whether anyone wants it to or not. They're not saying it out loud yet, but they're thinking it. That moment wasn't the end of something. It was the beginning of a shift. They're not ready to navigate, because now they have to move, knowing the room isn't what it used to be. Knowing you're not who they thought you were. Knowing that someone is willing to draw a line they didn't expect to be drawn. And as they sit with that realization, adjusting, recalibrating, pretending everything is normal, one thing becomes increasingly clear. The next move isn't going to come from the same place the last one did. And this time, they won't be able to pretend they didn't see it coming. Here's the part that's quietly hilarious if you know how these rooms actually work. Everyone is acting calm. Everyone is nodding. Everyone is speaking in neutral tones like nothing has shifted. But internally they're spiraling because the rules they depended on just proved optional. And once a rule becomes optional, it's already dead. They don't know how to function in environments where silence isn't guaranteed, where compliance isn't automatic, where someone might intervene at any moment without warning. They built their confidence on predictability, and predictability just walked out the door with that one sentence spoken on your behalf. Now they're trying to locate the source of the disruption, not you. You're the outcome. They're trying to figure out who went to war for you, and why, because power doesn't. Fear opposition nearly as much as it fears alliances it didn't authorize. The question bouncing around the room isn't, was that appropriate? It's who else would do that? And that question spreads fast. It infects decisions. It slows momentum. It turns every interaction into a risk assessment. Suddenly, people are choosing words more carefully, watching reactions, testing boundaries with half steps instead of full strides. They're also running a secondary calculation they'll never admit to. If someone was willing to step in like that, what does it say about you that they missed? What does it say about their judgment, their perception, their supposed ability to read the room? Because here's the uncomfortable truth they're brushing up against. People don't go to war for liabilities. They don't stake credibility on someone they think is weak, unstable, or expendable. That defense wasn't charity. It was a signal, and signals like that ripple far beyond the moment itself. This is where the humor turns dark if you're paying attention. The same people who once dismissed you are now scrambling to position themselves closer to neutrality. Not support, not alliance. Neutrality, because neutrality feels safer when the ground is moving. They're not apologizing. They're not acknowledging the shift directly. They're just adjusting behavior in small, almost comical ways. Slightly kinder tones, sudden interest, convenient amnesia about previous assumptions. It would be funny if it wasn't so predictable. And you're not reacting at all. That's the part that's driving them insane. You're not basking. You're not leveraging the moment socially. You're not changing how you show up to signal victory. You're not reminding anyone what happened. You're letting the silence do the work again. But this time, it's a different kind of silence. This one is heavy, charged, full of implications. It's the silence of someone who doesn't need to prove they'll be protected because the protection already revealed itself. They're starting to understand something they really don't like, that the defense didn't come from loyalty built over years of social grooming. It came from respect built through observation. Someone watched how you move, how you operate, how you don't collapse under pressure, how you don't perform insecurity for sympathy, how you don't beg for relevance. And they decided quietly that letting the room misread you any longer was inefficient. That's the kind of reasoning that terrifies people who rely on dominance through optics rather than substance. So now the room is haunted by a ghost question. If you weren't worth defending before, why are you now? And the only answer that makes sense is the one they don't want to face. You didn't suddenly become something you always were. They just weren't paying attention because they were too busy managing appearances. That realization hits hard because it exposes a deeper flaw. Their system doesn't identify real leverage early. It identifies compliance. It identifies noise. It identifies people who perform importance loudly enough to be seen. You didn't do that. You let time do its thing. You let patterns reveal themselves. You let results accumulate quietly. And when the moment came, someone else recognized the value before the room could erase it again. That's not luck. That's inevitability finally surfacing. And inevitability is impossible to argue with once it becomes visible. Now they're dealing with the fallout, subtle but real. Decisions are being second-guessed. Conversations are being revisited. People are wondering who's watching them the way that person watched you. Because if you slipped past their radar, who else might be doing the same? The room has lost its sense of omissions, and that loss creates paranoia disguised as professionalism. There's also something else happening beneath the surface, something even more destabilizing. The defense wasn't emotional, it wasn't dramatic, it was clean, almost boring. And boring disruptions are the worst kind. They don't give you something obvious to fight. You can't accuse it of bias or overreaction. You can't dismiss it as theatrics. It just sits there undeniable, like a data point that refuses to go away. And every time someone tries to move forward as if nothing happened, it's there in the background, quietly contradicting the old narrative. They're realizing now that the power dynamic didn't glitch because of you. It glitched because of what your presence forced someone else to acknowledge. And once that acknowledgement exists, the room can't return to pretending you're invisible. They can try. They will try. But it won't work the same way, because now invisibility would require active effort, and effort reveals intent. Here's where the chaotic part creeps in. They're starting to overcorrect. People who never noticed you before are suddenly hyper-aware. People who never spoke to you are suddenly polite. People who once dismissed your ideas are suddenly curious. It's awkward, transparent, almost embarrassing, like watching a system try to patch itself in real time while pretending nothing broke. And the more they tried to smooth it over, the more obvious the fracture becomes. You can feel the room stretching out, can't you? Trying to accommodate a reality it wasn't designed for, trying to hold you in a category that no longer fits. You're not the problem they managed. You're not the variable they minimized. You're something else now, in their perception. A risk, a wild card, a reminder that their control was never as absolute as they believed. And that realization doesn't inspire confidence. It inspires caution. What really rattles them is that the person who spoke up didn't need to explain themselves. They didn't justify their stance. They didn't soften the impact. They said what needed to be said and let it land. That kind of authority doesn't argue. It declares. And declarations shift gravity, whether people like it or not. The room adjusted because it had to, not because it wanted to. Now, imagine being someone who built their influence on being the loudest voice, the most confident presence, the unchallenged narrator. Imagine realizing that one calm sentence from someone else can undo years of quiet positioning. That's the fear they're sitting with now. Not fear of you directly, but fear of what you represent. A future where their dominance depends on actual substance instead of repetition. And this is where it becomes clear that moment wasn't about protection. It was about exposure. It exposed who had been comfortable with your marginalization. It exposed who benefited from the old dynamic. It exposed who assumed silence meant permission. And exposure changes how people behave long after the moment passes. They're watching you now, trying to predict what you'll do next. But the problem is, they're still using the wrong model. They think the next move will come from you directly. Another action, another statement, another visible disruption. They don't understand yet that the real shift already happened. The board changed, the pieces didn't. And that misunderstanding is about to cost them, because while they're focused on you, while they're tracking your expressions, your tone, your timing, they're missing the more dangerous variable entirely. The room itself has changed. The social gravity has shifted. The permissions they relied on are no longer assumed. And once that happens, power stops flowing the way it used to. It starts leaking slowly at first, almost politely, until one day someone realizes decisions aren't landing the way they used to. Instructions don't carry the same weight. Assumptions don't close conversations anymore. That's when panic sets in. Because panic is what happens when authority discovers it needs consent. Here's the part they don't want to acknowledge. The person who went to war for you didn't just speak once and disappear back into neutrality. They altered how everyone else is now allowed to think. They created a precedent, and precedent is lethal to fragile hierarchies, because precedent gives other people ideas. It whispers that intervention is possible, that silence is optional, that you don't always have to wait your turn, if the turn was never meant to come. That whisper spreads faster than any announcement ever could. Now the room is full of people pretending they don't hear it, while secretly wondering if they should act on it next time. And that internal debate is corrosive. It slows everything down. It creates hesitation where there used to be certainty. And certainty was the only thing holding the structure together. They didn't realize how dependent they were on it until it cracked. You see, systems like this don't collapse because of rebellion. They collapse because of confidence erosion. Because once people see that authority can be challenged cleanly and survive, they start reassessing their own limits. They start noticing where they've been shrinking unnecessarily. They start asking why certain lines existed in the first place. And those questions don't stay theoretical. They show up in meetings, in decisions, in moments where someone pauses instead of complying instantly. That pause is where power goes to die. They're also realizing something else, something deeply uncomfortable. That defense wasn't reactive. It wasn't emotional. It was anticipatory. It came from someone who could see where things were headed and decided to intervene before the assailer. Damage became obvious to everyone else. That means someone in the room understands trajectories better than they do. Someone who can read future consequences while others are still clinging to past arrangements. And that realization is quietly devastating, because now the question isn't just why did they defend you? It's what do they see coming that we don't? And once that question exists, trust in leadership fractures. Not publicly, internally, in the places that matter. People start hedging, preparing contingencies, keeping options open. The room becomes a collection of individuals protecting themselves instead of a unified structure enforcing order. That's when things really start slipping. And all of this is happening while you remain almost offensively calm. You're not escalating. You're not exploiting the moment. You're not acting like someone who just gained leverage. You're acting like someone who always knew this was inevitable. And that demeanor reframes the entire event. It suggests that the defense wasn't a surprise to you either, that it was simply timing, aligning with reality. That's the part that really messes with their heads. Because if you expected this, if you knew someone would eventually draw that line, then what else do you know? What else are you prepared for? What else is already in motion that they haven't clocked yet? Power hates uncertainty, and you've become a walking source of it without doing anything overt. Just by existing differently, just by refusing to react the way they're used to. Now the humor turns even darker. They're trying to restore balance using the same tools that just failed them. More meetings, more alignment conversations, more vague statements about collaboration and shared values. All of it feels hollow now, because everyone remembers the moment when those values were ignored, until someone decided they weren't optional anymore. The words don't land. They can't. The spell is broken. Pear's throat. They're also quietly monitoring the person who spoke up for you. Watching their interactions, analyzing their tone, trying to determine whether that moment was a one-time anomaly or the start of a pattern. Because if it's a pattern, then the power map needs to be redrawn. And redrawing maps means admitting the old ones were wrong. People build careers on those maps. Egos, identities, entire self-concepts. That's not something they're eager to confront. So instead, they stall. They observe. They delay decisions. They hope momentum will return on its own. But momentum doesn't return after a moment like that. It either transforms or it collapses.